All right, so over the past 2 days, we heard a lot early on about why Ruskin didn't like America. I mean, we don't have enough castles here. At the time, I guess we had 0 castles. At least now we have Hearst Castle. I think there we go, Scotty's Castle. That's a stretch. He didn't like our attitudes, didn't like our art. There were a whole bunch of reasons in the mid to late 1800s that he did not like America. And you know, our country was in its infancy. We were still a pretty young country at that point. We also had some major issues in the middle of the 19th century that we fought through. But you know, I think the 20th century is the century where we grew up, and obviously we became a world power. So my first question for you all is, if, this is a little hypothetical, if Ruskin lived to the year 2000, if he had seen the 20th century, do you think that his opinions on America would have changed? A whole 100 years. Let's take his death of 1900 to 2000. What do you think he would think of America? Would his opinions change at all based on?
More horrifying.
I was going to say,
Well, see, I was saying the year 2000 before, say, social media or artificial intelligence or, you know, a lot of crazy things that have happened in the 21st century. So I just said, you know, 100 years from his death. But go ahead. I want to hear from you all.
Well, my feeling is that his worst fears would have been confirmed. You know, it's one of the phrases I like in what Ruskin said to Norton is when he talks about the restlessness. That you don't rest here, and you don't know what you're aiming at. You don't really know what you want to become, and that's a very powerful, I think, piece of insight. I also think, you know, I think part of why Ruskin speaks, I mean, he doesn't speak a great deal about America, frankly. I mean, Norton told him he didn't know anything about America, and Ruskin agreed with him. So he doesn't write a great deal about it, but I think when he does, it's with a kind of passion, because I think Ruskin saw the ills that he describes in Unto This Last, Man is a Covetous Machine of Adam Smith, you know, on steroids in America. So I think he was afraid of that influence, frankly, both in Britain, and then we find him writing about, worrying about American influence on Germany, worrying about American influence in Europe for the same reason. He sees this kind of, to use my own phrase, of kind of false anthropology, a false view of the person as simply a covetous machine of self-interest that he feared. That, you know, the cultural and economic influence of that on other parts of the world.
I think he would find that, I think you might find that even Britain had become more like America too.
Right.
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, I think he'd be very distressed.
What about the New Deal, though? Wouldn't he have approved of that? I guess I'm looking at Gray for that one, but anyone else feel free to weigh in?
I definitely think he would have. I think he would have approved. I mean, you know, that's why I paired those photographs because they're almost indistinguishable, except that the clothes have changed. So I think he would have been very approving of the New Deal, except that I was reading about Octavia Hill, whose opposition to bureaucracy and government kind of startled me, actually. So I'm not sure how she would have, or whether she would have approved of the New Deal, except that it carried out so many of her ideals for the settlement house movement. You know much more about Octavia Hill than I do.
Well, just that there's a direct connection between her development of the settlement house situation in London Ruskin's financing it.
Mhm.
So one day. Yeah, you have such a strong connection there.
But then there was, her advocacy for nature preservation
For nature
too.
and the
The
historic
National
preservation.
Trust. Uh-huh.
Yeah,
hmm
yeah.
And there was a great deal of that in the new, I mean, I've also found that in the New Deal, there was a great deal of historic, well, I showed the Federal Records Project, on which we historians, we're standing on the shoulders of those people
Yeah.
who saved those records that would have been lost. But also there was a great deal of historic preservation,
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. Then Morris's influence and all that too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
We certainly done them wrong, though, with the tobacco boxes. But we also developed, there's the Sierra Club and other environmental organizations that sprang up largely in the 20th century, which I would think he would be a fan of.
Well, I think he'd be a fan of those kinds of things, any of those efforts to conservation and community building and all of that. But those are always people fighting against the kind of reigning values and ideology, which I think have tended even more towards consumerism and kind of hyper-capitalism. So, but I mean, even like the Guild of St. George was his attempt to work against, to swim against the tide, right? And it was a minority effort, and I think that the kind of groups you're talking about, even though, they do have some influence and power and they raise money, they still are a drop in the bucket against, that's a very negative view, I'm sorry. But I just think that he would support those efforts, but I don't think he would support the general tendency of the country. Maybe a better way to say it.
But it would have been harder for him to escape. I mean, the commentary earlier that he'd never come to the United States, despite having opinions about it. It's funny to think, through the New Deal, through World War II, right? And sorry. Yes, thank you. I was just saying, it would have been obviously much more challenging for him to escape American influence and ideas in the 20th century. And the relationship between America and England during World War II would have, I'm curious, I don't know anything about Winston Churchill and Churchill's relationship to Ruskin or influence. That would have been an interesting angle to think about, right? Where would he have sat? And that, anyway, that just came to mind when you asked the question suddenly.
They both like the theater. I do know that.
Well, the five of you have heard everybody else's, sorry, that. I'm just going to turn that off, that's a little problematic. So the five of you have heard each other. Do you have any general questions for the rest of you that you want to spark conversation among you? Feel free, go ahead. Sorry, I just threw that right back onto all of you.
I'm just thinking, yeah.
But what questions would you like to, what more would you like to see answered about Ruskin and America?
Well, like I said in my talk, I mean, I'm thinking, I do want to work on a project on Ruskin by thinking about slavery more widely. And I was talking to Amy Woodson-Bolton, who was here, who's written already on that. I didn't realize that, and so we have something to talk about there. And I think that would be very interesting to develop that some more.
Well, Gabriel was talking about, his affinity for the picturesque. And then when you were talking, I was thinking about Thomas Moran, who I guess was, he was a bit later. I more think of Ruskin as having an affinity for the sublime, particularly his love of the Alps. And so I wonder what he would have thought if he had seen Moran or Bierstadt's paintings of the West.
Yeah.
I think he would have changed his opinions of it, because I think he would have just loved not just Yosemite, because every time I go into Yosemite Valley, it shakes my atheism. You think, how could dumb ice have just created such a place? But of course, the Grand Canyon, the big trees and everything else, I think he would have loved it. Even though we do have Hearst Castle, as you said.
Right.
I would be interested in finding out if there's any connections between Ruskin and the civil rights movement.
Ooh.
And that's not something I've looked into, but we know that Gandhi has completely changed his life because of Ruskin. Martin Luther King was influenced by Gandhi. I'm wondering if there's a lineage there that it would be interesting to think about.
I'll send you a piece, friend of ours,
Yeah.
and with Tim Holton, he's a frame maker in Berkeley, wonderful craftsman. He wrote a piece, he keeps a blog, and he writes about most of the things to do with art and framing, but he's really deeply devoted to Ruskinian, and he works in the Ruskinian spirit. He wrote an excellent piece on Martin Luther King and Ruskin.
Oh, wonderful.
So I'll source that and send it to you.
Great,
Yeah.
great.
Maybe we can make it available.
Yeah, that would be great.
That'd be great.
There's also a piece by Michael Bees at Marist School in Georgia on a very strong connection between Booker T. Washington
Yeah.
and the Tuskegee Institute
Mm.
and the Tuskegee artists and Ruskin. Not directly, but Booker T. Washington was deeply influenced by Ruskin and began to adopt various art education strategies for the Tuskegee Institute. So that's a fascinating connection.
Yeah, and that was a connection I hadn't known anything about. When I came across that article, I was really excited because it was really a different angle that I'd never seen anyone take before.
Right. Well, he's coming out here in
Yeah.
we're doing in I guess in April. He's going to give a talk on Booker T. Washington and Ruskin.
Gabe, what was the quote you showed me yesterday that was it Monet? Is it attributed Ruskin to Impressionism?
In an interview when Ruskin died, someone interviewed Monet about what he thought about Ruskin, and Monet said, every aspect of Impressionist theory is in the elements of drawing.
Wow.
This is wonderful.
The elements of drawing.
Yeah. Well, when you read the opening of the elements of drawing, Ruskin talks about dissociating identifications of forms. That when you look at the scene with the house and the tree, don't draw the house. Draw the form. Dissociate the identifications and just suddenly would be right out of Impressionist theory.
You know, another area that we could have talked about, and did so much about Ruskin, but New Urbanism. I mean, Ruskin influenced the New Urbanist movement.
No.
Ruskin influenced the New Urbanist movement.
Urbanist.
New Urbanist movement, yeah. So, the building of cities that are pedestrian friendly and that, combine multi-use communities and things like this. I wrote an article about it back in 2005, I think, for the Ruskin Bulletin, when it was still just the Ruskin Bulletin, the newsletter, because I had gone to Florida, to the Panhandle, Panhandle, it's the, where all the white beaches are. I think it is the Panhandle, right?
Yeah.
Is that what they call it?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't spend a lot of time in Florida. But I had gone down there, and my husband had work, and I was just walking around the town. We were in Seaside, Florida, and there was a street called Ruskin Street. And I thought, why in the world is Ruskin Street in this community in Florida? And then there was a Ruskin Artists community there, Ruskin Artists Colony. It was called that, had a sign. So I started doing some research and came upon, I didn't know a lot about the New Urbanist movement then, but a lot of the people who were active in it were influenced by Ruskin's ideas on communities and community building. So that was a really kind of interesting strain that
Yeah.
I hadn't expected to find. Sometimes you find Ruskin in the most unexpected places.
Exactly.
There I was, I was walking around this town I'd never been to and not expecting to have anything to do with Ruskin. And there he was.
He pops up everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, he's everywhere. We were talking, Gray, about garden cities. And the whole garden cities movement that grew out of Morris, but also out of Ruskin. And that was a major movement all over the world to try to create garden cities with green belts and to all of that. Much of it, sort of thrown off the table by World War I.
Well, and we're World War II too.
Yeah.
But, Eleanor Roosevelt, again, was behind the creation of these New Deal towns. Particularly, she was close to Rexford Tugwell. And so there may actually be some direct connection there because she would go out and visit these new towns, actually.
We often call Ruskin a polymath because of all of his varied interests, and we have heard that 5 very different talks in the past 24 hours here. Is there anyone that you can think of active in America today that you would say is like a modern Ruskin? That you would say this person is in the same vein. Pay attention to them.
I always say Wendell Berry.
Wendell Berry.
Yeah.
I gave a talk on Wendell Berry and Ruskin and brought the two of them together. Wendell Berry wouldn't call himself, a Ruskinian, but he does know Ruskin's work and admires it. But I just think his values, and his kind of worldview are very Ruskinian, just naturally. They align.
I wonder.
Chomsky would be another
Candidate.
Mhm.
Candidate.
I think about Buckminster Fuller. I wonder,
interesting.
in terms of a sort of Buckminster Fuller,
mhm.
in terms of a utopian vision in a way, thinking about equality, accessibility, design, right? Sort of salvation through design, and awareness of the environment. Yeah.
Well, I'd throw in Lewis Mumford,
Oh, yeah.
my
Yeah,
mentor.
absolutely.
Although, I can't think of anybody else who was had that breadth, but also was a
Yeah.
great artist in the way that
Yeah.
Ruskin was.
And writing.
I always wondered with Mumford, because he has a book called The Brown Decade.
Yeah.
Right,
Mhm.
and I wondered, there's a passage in Ruskin where he talks about the 19th century, and he says, he compares it to the Middle Ages,
Mhm.
how the Middle Ages were the ages of color and vibrancy. He says ours is the age of, it's a brown age. He uses that phrase, and I often wondered if Mumford is drawing on Ruskin, or if it's just a happy coincidence that the language is so similar.
I think there's a direct tie through Patrick Geddes.
Oh, okay.
Because Mumford always said that Geddes was his mentor, and Geddes was strongly influenced by Ruskin, so much so that Mumford named his son Geddes.
Oh, okay.
And he died he was shot down in the Second World War, and Mumford was never the same again.
The ecologist Paul Kingsnorth put me onto Mumford's Myth of the Machine,
Mhm.
which of course was 1970s, but it has that kind of breadth of vision,
Yeah.
systemic analysis of the situation. And I know Paul's very much taken with the notion of the destructive power of the machine and of power and technocracy in the hands of an elite.
Mhm.
And Ruskin's more anarchic, in a way,
Yeah.
vision of local power and localized solutions.
I'd say also that Kingsnorth is a polymath in training.
Sarah, when you were talking about Ruskin's dark view of nature, it made me think, in today's terminology, I think we'd probably say that he was bipolar. Would you say?
I don't know, I wouldn't actually.
Don't you think?
I don't know,
He did have extreme depression.
He did, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. I guess, like Sharon, I'm a little resistant to retrospective diagnoses, just because
Mhm.
it's hard to do. He clearly had mental health issues that he struggled with.
Mhm.
There's some very strong and moving descriptions of what it was like when he had his brain, he called his brain attacks.
Mhm.
There's at least 1 or 2 of those that are
Oh.
really striking.
Yeah.
And 'cause he was so frank about it.
Yeah.
But I think it's hard to know. He certainly was depressive.
There's some evidence that his family was
Yeah, there
His
was
grandfather.
His grandfather.
I would venture to call him clinically disappointed.
Well, yes, and he even says that, he felt that the fact that no one listened to him, had driven him to depression, and he links that with the mental health issues that he had. Now, who knows, but I think there was something clinical going on. I wouldn't know what to call it.
And you're not the first person I've heard suggest that it's bipolar but disorder, but the truth is, it could be something organic because since it was so progressive, that's what I wonder. But I don't know how we could ever figure that out.
Yeah.
Once when I was at Brentwood, Howard showed me in the study there was a set of Maria Edgeworth's novels. She was, and he was remarking that these were probably the set that the family used when they would read long winter evenings and read through Maria Edgeworth. And he said, "I want to show you something." He pulled the volume out and showed me the last page, the flyleaf. And Ruskin had written in pencil, clearly when he was in a manic state in those last years. And the writing was absolutely furious. Just pencil, like this, all across the page. Hard to read, couldn't quite read it, except the final scroll at the very bottom, "I am so afraid." God, it just broke your heart. Because apparently he could feel these coming.
Yeah.
And he knew that it was just going to be hell, and so you see that with that last line, "I'm so afraid."
Was he afraid for himself or for the world?
What's that?
Was he afraid for himself or for the world?
Greg, you said, sorry.
No, didn't he write Praeterita in episodes in between his bouts? How long did it take him to do it?
Well, which is why he didn't finish it.
Yeah. And there was a long break of several years in the letters, of course, but there's too.
Yeah.
So.
And then the ending of Praeterita, it's absolutely mad, and it's absolutely magnificent. It is like if you were going to leave the world with that he goes back and he imagines that he's in Siena, and he and Charles Eliot Norton that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And Rosie is there, and all these people who are dead are there, and they're watching the fireflies.
It is a gorgeous
In the
passage.
field, it's just this incredible passage, and that's.
I don't think it's mad, though. I wouldn't call it mad.
Well, but mad in the sense of
Yeah.
of people being there that will
Oh,
work
yeah,
there.
yeah, but it's such a controlled and beautiful, yeah.
Well, I've thought of,
Right.
It's your life as you remember it, and only the parts that you want to remember. I mean, you didn't mention Effie, you didn't mention a 6-year marriage, and it's so-called autobiography.
Yeah.
No, it's a memoir. You can put in projected things that you would want to remember.
Yeah, and with Praeterita, there's been some critics along the way who have said it's not truthful because he leaves those things out and everything. But
Who cares?
It's a memoir. Who cares? and there's this core of truth in it, his truth, because it reflects his own feelings about his life. It's really what matters.
I mean, he starts out by saying he had no choice.
Right. Really? Right. Yeah. So. Any other reflections or questions? No?
Oh, I just wanted to say to Sharon, I mean, I was really struck by his, he was a mineralogist, among
Yes, he
other
was.
things.
He absolutely was. Yes.
And so, and he loved crystals. And Bob, did we see, wasn't there, his collection, I think, was on display in London. Didn't we see a...
That was, the guild at Sheffield had
Yeah,
a
they
large,
definitely had.
Sheffield
That's
had a lot
right,
of it,
uh-huh.
yeah.
Yeah.
Brentwood has some, yeah.
The Astor place had,
Yes, there was a big Ruskin show at Astor, what is it?
Vincent Astor's place. Oh, Temple Place.
Temple Place, yeah,
Uh-huh.
that was in 2019 for the bicentenary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Sheffield also has a great collection.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
And I was so glad that you brought in Ethics of the Desk, 'cause I love that book.
Mhm.
And I don't think it gets enough attention.
I
Right.
agree.
Yeah, but the whole methodology of it, and
Yeah.
I mean, I wrote about it in my book because it's such a teaching book, right?
Yes,
But I love that
absolutely.
you brought up the fact that I really hadn't thought about before, that it's like a series of plays.
Oh, it totally is.
Yeah, it is very
Yeah.
theatrical, and
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, with choreography and everything.
Everything, yep.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's, if you're looking to read more Ruskin, Ethics of the Dust is one that should be read.
Yeah.
Any
Yeah.
connection to John Stone?
I mean,
There has to be.
True, I
to
couldn't.
John
hear-
Stone, the collector,
Oh.
Stone Museum.
Look at the index.
Yeah.
Nice.
I don't know.
The new biography of Stone.
Ah.
Oh,
The new curator, current curator. And it's extraordinary. Yeah, it's lively, it's great to do. It's not just fun. They have an article that the first curator of the Stone Museum, the first director of the Stone Museum, a long time ago, did. I heard about this, I don't know. Stone, how do you think about that? Anybody?
It's, I've wanted to go for years, haven't been, no.
It's Ruskin's time,
Mm.
in a sense. It's
Mhm.
a polymath.
Yeah.
Stone is a polymath.
Are you saying Sir John Stone?
Yeah.
Oh,
No, no,
I thought you
Stone.
said Stone.
No,
as in-
Stone.
Oh, Stone. Oh, that's a wonderful
S-O-A-N,
place.
yeah.
Yes, it's truly remarkable.
Don't you think of Ruskin when you?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, it's a jewel box in near the Thames, yeah.
It's funny you use that phrase, because someone said about the Guild Museum, the original Guild Museum, someone who had visited it during that time, that it was, described it as much treasure in a little room. Yeah.
So, we can start wrapping things up. Okay, we're gonna have one last question
Okay.
from Elena, and then,
Not really a question, because I was thinking you're all talking about different levels and aspects of the intersectionality.
Mhm.
And, not only between different studies, but in terms of existence. Sharon in particular was reading some great quotes. I was trying to think of this quote, but one of my favorites, it's a very small book by Carlo Rovelli. He's a physicist, and he's talking about particle entanglement here, but he said all things are continually interacting with one another. And it's just much like the quote you read.
Yeah.
And in doing so, each bears the traces of that which it has interacted. A raindrop contains information on the presence of a cloud in the sky.
Yeah. And I think Ruskin sensed all that, even before all the scientific evidence maybe was amassed. Ruskin sensed all that interconnection and that the whole sense of organic unity, which runs through everything that he writes, and which is just key to his thinking.
And I think that was the distinction you made earlier too about the difference between clinical drawing and whole body interacting with mind-body drawing.
Mhm.
Which my dad was very much about. My father was a very famous drawing teacher, and he talked about that
Yeah.
continually. So in other words, like an actor too, embodying the character, knowing as much as they could about the character, but then, you have to use your own emotional states of mind and your background to also inform
Mhm.
something about that character.
Yeah.
So there's just so many things. But
When someone,
what a wonderful group of talks today. Thank you.
it's been really fun to do this. Yeah.
One thing I just wanted to mention in terms of the question that's come up several times about what Ruskin would think about Yosemite. Well, Denise Levertov thought about that,
Oh, okay.
and she wrote a poem.
I didn't know she did.
She wrote a poem in which she places Ruskin and Muir together in Yosemite.
How did I not know that?
Yeah.
You have to send me
I will.
Yeah.
So,
You said
I-
that's what
I also
Yeah,
really
yeah,
like
yeah.
her.
It's a Denise
Yeah.
Levertov in
I like her
1990
work, yeah.
collection in the Evening Train
Oh,
collection.
okay.
Yeah, and she it's a long poem, and she does a beautiful thing. She weaves in and out quotations from Praeterita about Ruskin's first encounter with the Alps.
Mhm.
Oh,
And it's
okay.
just, it's a magnificent
Yeah, you
little
said that.
interweaving.
Yeah,
So, see, a poet can do anything.
that's right.
So-
That's a wonderful last note to
Yeah, I agree.
poet can do.
And
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. We have a mailing list